Well, hello and welcome to a live version of Adam Gary's Music Box. And like I've been saying, I'm going to try to do these Saturday and Sunday. And minus any technical disasters like we've had throughout the day, I think that mostly it will be smooth sailing. So today I want to sail to Japan because Japan is a country that has long fascinated global listeners of music because they have one of the most interesting music scenes in the world. And you can approach this from several different areas. And I kind of want to talk about all of those today. So the first is from the international listener's perspective, from the perspective of the record collector. And for this, we really need to begin in the 70s, because it was in the 70s where, unfortunately, the physical quality of the vinyl that people were buying in America and Europe started to degrade. And the reason that the vinyl got less in quality is that the price of oil got more per dollar. There was the oil crisis of the 70s. There were actually a couple of oil crises in the 70s. So it was a great decade, but not necessarily the most well lubricated one if you were mechanically inclined. And so the vinyl industry suffered because the record labels in the broader West, in Europe and North America, they decided to cut these corners. Then some interesting people discovered something about Japan. In Japan, they did not cut corners on the quality of vinyl. And in fact, some of the vinyl that you had in Japan at this time was superior even to some of the pre oil crisis vinyl in the Western world. And thus began the wonderful, exciting, and at times time consuming and expensive world of importing Japanese vinyls into other countries. They were sought after then, they've been sought after since, they remain sought after now. The vinyl, people noticed, was very quiet. So background noise, static, crap like that was largely absent compared to the vinyls made elsewhere. The covers were generally made of very high material, the record jackets themselves, and then there was something called the OB, spelled OBI. And this is something that you've probably seen. It's a little strip on the side of the record jacket that you can sort of slip on and off. And this contains the information in the Japanese language that would otherwise be contained on the cover and in some of the liner notes. And these OBs themselves are so collectible that if you're selling a Japanese LP with a broken or missing OB, it will generally sell for less. We're a fanatical bunch, us record collectors. And then something really interesting happened when Mobile Fidelity, which in many ways I consider to be the first of all the audiophile record labels, when they formed in 77, they were looking for physical vinyl that would be superior to any on the market. And this quest took them to Japan, where they discovered that JVC had a new formulation for vinyl that was called super vinyl. And it's what MoFi decided to use for their original master recording series, the first run of MoFi records that we all know and love. And it wasn't just that you had people like Stan Ricker, wonderful mastering engineers, mastering these albums on the best cutting equipment from master tapes played on the best tape reproducers. It was also that you had this dead quiet vinyl, no background noise, a marvel to listen to. And to this day, I don't know if a better batch of physical vinyl has ever been created than that which JVC created in the 70s. They were really, in terms of the vinyl and in terms of their pressings, so very much ahead of their time. Now, when the digital age came in, the Japanese tended to embrace the CD as well, because the CD was an invention of Sony and Philips. Philips being a company from the Netherlands, and Sony, of course, being one of the biggest companies in Japan. So the CD was a very Japan-centric format, and some of the masterings on Japanese CDs are preferable to the non-Japanese pressings, because in those days you would have, and by those days I mean the 80s, you would have very frequently different masterings from on the US edition, the European edition, the Japanese version. Sometimes even within Europe, there would be a German mastering, a French mastering, a UK mastering. That was just the nature of the CD supply chain at the time. And very frequently, the Japanese, just as they did with vinyl, they scored big again on the CD, because even though the physical texture of the CD doesn't really matter as much by a long shot as it does for vinyl, the Japanese were still ahead of the game. And then Sony in the late 90s came out with this super audio CD, the SACD, the granddaddy of quality in this digital format movement. And Japan really took to the SACD, comparatively speaking. The format remains something that labels like Acoustic Sounds, Analog Productions, MoFi, they still make them. But on the whole, the major record labels stopped making SACDs relatively quickly. They went from really trying to push the format in 99 and the early 2000s to by 2010, most of the major Western record labels had all but given up on the format, relegating it to the audiophile world. Not so in Japan. In Japan, you have lots of SACDs that are completely unavailable in the rest of the world except as imports. And there is a huge import market for these Japanese SACDs. And there's some really good stuff in so many genres: European classical music, Japanese music, rock music from the Western world. Did I say jazz? Did I say classical? I think I may have done. But the variety is great, and you're hearing pressings that are typically very good. There are some duds, but most of these Japan made for Japan SACDs are really, really good. So let's talk about why Japanese audiences are such musical connoisseurs. Music still has a very vital role in the Japanese culture in a way that I think has been lost in many, many other cultures. Musicians are treated with respect in Japan, which is frankly something that they're being treated with less and less of outside of Japan. When folk music began in Europe, let's take European folk music as an example. The troubadour, the musician, was always considered someone of low social status. In other and this is particular to Northern Europe, and in other cultures, this wasn't the case. As music became profitable as a commercial enterprise in the 19th and 20th centuries, this of course changed. But now, as we're seeing music becoming generally less profitable in the 21st century than it was in the 20th, musicians are losing respect once again. And that has a knock on effect. It means music education programs are seeing the plug pulled. It means that young people aren't really encouraged to get into music the way they really ought to be. In Japan, the level of respect for musicians was always very high, and it's remained remarkably consistent. Japanese people really do, as an audience, seem to gravitate towards quality, which is why a lot of the music that's gone out of fashion in Europe and America, your jazz fusions, funk, prog rock, certain genres of heavy rock, all of these remain genres that can sell out big arenas in Japan, that can sell SACDs, that can sell vinyls, that can sell special Japan only box sets. There's still this value in Japan to the music itself. And maybe part of that, in addition to the cultural reverence and appreciation for high quality music and the craftsmanship that a musical artist must have. One thing that's also differentiated Japan from every other market is the fact that physical media is still a major part of the Japanese consumption cycle when it comes to music. Yes, they have streaming services in Japan, but the Japanese marketplace tended to adopt streaming much slower than other markets did. And there's still something that the Japanese treasure about physical formats. You still have record stores in Japan, some of them with names that will be very familiar, like Tower Records. Tower Records doesn't exist in America where it was formed anymore, but it exists in Japan. And other names like Virgin, still see there. Record shops are still large and they're a big deal to Japanese buyers. And some people do have a theory that when you're getting music for either free or next to free, which is pretty much how the streaming world is, you value it less, you treasure it less. When you're paying top dollar for a physical format, you tend to value it more. That might be a part of it. But on Japanese television, you see a lot of musicians, local musicians, playing cover versions of your favorite Western songs, if you will. Just Google things like Japanese television Frank Sinatra, Japanese television Deep Purple, Japanese television Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and you will see Japanese artists replicate the music of countries like America, the UK, Canada, Australia, and they're doing it with such reverence and such musical excellence that you really just have to sit back and smile at this wonderful music scene in Japan. Now, Japanese audiences also love seeing bands play live. And I'm talking about the bands from Europe, from America, from elsewhere. Deep Purple were one of the first major bands to really wave the Japanese flag when they released their infamous and much beloved Made in Japan album. Now, the joke at the time, because nothing with Ian Gillan can escape a good pun, the joke at the time was that Made in Japan was almost a mark of shame because Japan in the early 70s was known for being very efficient at mass producing goods, but they became so good at it that a few years later, the best stereos, or certainly among the best, the most reliable cars, the best vinyl, was all made in Japan. So Japan very quickly, when you would see Made in Japan, it became a hallmark of excellence where even Western brands like Marantz, one of the very finest audio brands in terms of audio equipment from the US, in the 70s, they switched their production to Japan. And it began quality. Japan became associated with quality. But what about Japanese musicians playing original music? Sadly, this is something that us non Japanese audiences have been deprived of. But there are some wonderful, and I mean globally brilliant by any standard, musicians that have come out of Japan from the middle of the 20th century onwards. Of course, there's always been great musicians in Japan, but it was from sort of the mid 20th century onwards when they were playing the kind of music that we non-Japanese would recognize. And I want to particularly talk about some of the great jazz fusion artists in Japan, starting with one of the greatest guitarists in the world. Not just one of the greatest in Japan, but one of the greatest in the world. And this is Kazumi Watanabe, an absolute virtuoso. And he's played with so many artists of international renown. He's played with Jaco Pastorius, for instance. And one of the best things that he's done, in my view, among his many good things, was a project called The Spice of Life. And there were two albums released under this Spice of Life moniker in the mid 80s. And it was a trio that featured Kazume on guitar and guitar synth. It featured Jeff Berlin, the great American bass player, and featured Bill Bruford, the great English drummer, who was playing his pitched electronic Simmons drums at the time. Luckily, there was a concert that they filmed in Japan in 1985, and I'm just going to check for you to see if it is still on YouTube. Because this concert is something that you really, really ought to see if the full thing is still there. It looks like it is from a channel called Acme Videos, so shout out to them. I don't know if this is an official, but it is there. So I'm going to subscribe to Acme Video right now. They say they're not monetized, so it's like a fan thing. I think that's really cool. I'll put that in the description of this video. Once I'm done doing the live, I'll put it in the comments section for you there now, because this is all original music written by Kazume. And it's performed so well by musicians that non-Japanese audiences will be instantly familiar with. But you should really take a deep dive into Kazumi's wider discography, because everything he did was virtuosic, innovative, and he is such a great composer. Now, another great Japanese musician who, again, I came to discover because he played with some of my favorite musicians from outside of Japan was Stomu Yamashita. Now, Stomu Yamashita was, again, in the jazz fusion sphere, leading more towards the rocky side, towards the prog rocky side, but with some definite and strong jazz influences. And all of his projects were really, really good. But the project that really got me into his stuff was something from 1976 called Go, as in the opposite of stop. And it featured such wonderful musicians from all over the world. You had Steve Winwood on keyboards and vocals, Michael Shreve, the great drummer from Santana, Pat Thrall, wonderful guitar player, Roscoe G, bass player who was working with Traffic at that time. Again, the Steve Winwood connection. Al Di Meola, one of the great guitarists ever. This was at the height of his Return to Forever career. And it is such a good, complete album. You're going to love it. And they did a sequel with some different musicians the following year called Go 2. And you had Al Di Meola returning. You had Linda Lewis, wonderful on vocals. Paul Jackson, great bass player from the Headhunters. So definitely check out the Go series from Stomu Yamashita, but check out all of the other great stuff that he's done as well, because I think that you'll really like it. What can you say other than Jiro Inagaki? Again, apologies if I'm not pronouncing some of them right, but check him out and his band Soul Media, not social media, but Soul Media. Classic jazz funk fusion from the mid 70s. All of his albums so good. And one thing you'll notice about all of these Japanese albums is that they were recorded really well. The recording engineers in Japan just as good as the mastering engineers. Again, this has a lot to do with the fact that it's coming from a culture that places a strong value on music. And that includes both the musicians and the way that the music is recorded and distributed and received by the consumer. Tatsuro Yamashita, again, apologies for the bad pronunciation. This is sort of getting into your 80s style fusion more. Really, really good. At this time, also, you saw a lot of interesting musical instruments coming out of Japan. They started sort of becoming big players in the sophisticated synthesizer game. Again, they began by making synthesizers that were cheaper and sometimes less quality than those made in America, Britain, and in other parts of Europe. But by the late 70s, their synthesizers were becoming really, really good. Even before the late 70s, Yamaha was doing some really great stuff, and their GX1 in the late 70s, possibly the most interesting synthesizer ever made. And Yamaha continued to dominate more and more throughout the 80s, as did Korg, another Japanese company. So there's so much to explore in Japan in terms of the music scene. And one of the things that makes it somewhat more difficult to discover some of these artists, particularly on a format like Spotify, is sometimes the names will be spelled in the Latin alphabet and sometimes they'll be spelled in the Japanese alphabet. So if you discover them just through your search engines, through a video like this, through Google, here's a hot tip, try running it through a translating device and putting it into a streaming service in the Japanese alphabet. That might help. But I guess the message of this is just sort of 3 cheers for Japan, because they've really done some interesting things with music. Now, back on the other side of the world, today would have been Marvin Isley's birthday, the great bass player from the Isley Brothers. Now, the Isley Brothers are one of my absolute favorite bands of all time. They were certainly one of the most, if not the most versatile band ever. They started out in the doo-wop era, and they still, albeit in a reduced capacity, because some of the brothers have sadly left us, they still put out material under the name, the surviving members, mainly collaborations between Ronald Isley and Ernie Isley. But they covered so many genres, but the time that they were at their peak is when they were at their biggest, because they invited other brothers and cousins, the extended family version of the Isleys that dominated in the 70s. And this, in addition to the 3 vocalists who started the band, fronted, of course, by Ronald Isley, you had Marvin on bass, cousin Chris Jasper on the keyboards, Ernie Isley on guitar. And just like, and also the drums, Ernie was very versatile as they all were. And voila, you had the most virtuosic soul band of all time. Chris Jasper, for instance, Juilliard educated composer, and you can really hear that he has such a profound knowledge of harmony and of chords and of song structure. Ernie Isley, the most underrated guitar player ever. He's if you combine Jimi Hendrix with McLaughlin and add in so much funk and soul, even more funk than what Hendrix was doing, that would be Ernie Isley, a true virtuoso who should be on lists with people like McLaughlin, like Jimi Hendrix, like Robin Trower, like Eddie Van Halen. He's up there in terms of one of the people who did so much with the guitar. And really made it work. And he's a damn good drummer too. And the albums that the Isleys of this era came out with, every single one of them was great. They didn't have any weak albums. They had their own label, T-Neck. They were really just churning them out, but so well. Live performances, sadly, not as well documented as they should be. There's some video that's coming out from that era, little by little. We're seeing it leak online. The Midnight Special, thankfully, had them on a few times, and I've been a huge advocate for the fact that every Friday they put out a new episode without any interruptions, without any edits on the Midnight Special YouTube channel. So definitely go hunting for any live material of the Isleys you can find from that era, because they were good live. Wish we had more evidence, but the evidence we do have on record or on videotape is really good. Marvin was a wonderful bass player, and the sound that he had in the studio going off of Ernie's drum track really amounted to such a wonderful rhythm section. Literally everyone in that band, from the vocalist to the instrumentalist, was truly a virtuoso. Marvin, of course, also participated in an 80s side project called Joe Biden moment, folks, called Isley Jasper Isley. And this was, of course, Ernie Isley on guitar and some vocals, Chris Jasper on keyboard and some vocals, and Marvin Isley on bass and some vocals. And they did some really good stuff. Hollywood or Broadway to Sunset was a great album and song that they did in the mid-80s. Caravan of Love was a big hit for them. Sadly, Marvin died quite a few years back. He suffered from terrible complications from diabetes. Too many of the Isleys aren't with us anymore, so just, feel blessed that you've got the ones that you have. And finally, I want to talk about how it was on this day that the Doors were signed to an independent record label at the time called Elektra. And the Doors are a band that I've always loved so much. And I fear that they sometimes suffer from popularity, which sounds like a contradiction in terms. But it can happen. There are a lot of bands in this sort of segment where the name and the imagery and the mythology can become so widely pervasive in the culture that people forget about the music. And Jim Morrison as an individual and the Doors as a concept, they're mythical in the way people look at the music world. But I think that people forget they were really good musicians. Ray Manzarek on the keys, John Densmore on the drums, Robbie Krieger on the guitar. What more could you want? They had great improvisational skills. They could go wherever the music took them. They could go wherever their lead singer took them, which was often to some very interesting places indeed. And the combination just worked really well. I think Jim Morrison was frankly a very good vocalist. His own father, thanks Dad, said that he wasn't, but I think he was a good vocalist. We all know that he had one of the best, if not the best stage presences of any of any lead vocalist in history. And the Doors also did something that I think makes them similar to Van Halen in the sense that they invented a new version of the LA sound. Because as a big city and the city where the music industry was either anchored or or before it really became anchored there, because it was New York, but LA always had an important music industry, even before it really became LA centric in terms of the global music industry in the 70s and 80s. You have to remember the LA music scene at the time that the Doors were becoming popular, it was dominated by a lot of 12-string guitar driven folk rock. Think the Byrds, think a band called Love that were a bit more psychedelic, but still in that genre. And here come the Doors. They were louder, they were darker, and perhaps most interestingly of all, they were jazzier. They really said, we're not really so much influenced by folky 12-string guitar, we're influenced by jazz. And it really became clear in their music that you could call the Doors a kind of jazz rock fusion band. I mean, in that they brought certain jazz and certain improvisational sensibilities and sense of harmonies to the rock charts. And in doing so, they became a quintessential LA band. They were a band deeply associated with the clubs of the Sunset Strip. And the reason that I link this to Van Halen, albeit very different sounds, Van Halen reinvented the LA sound, because when the Doors came, everyone wanted to be the Doors. Not many people could be. When Van Halen came out, everyone wanted to be Eddie Van Halen. Not everyone could be. And for a city, for a scene that's come up with so many interesting bands over the years, the Doors and Van Halen are my favorites. And luckily, someone from Elektra Records agreed. And in the short period that Jim Morrison was with us, they put out a lot of good material. So to bring things back to Japan, let me know in the comments when you're watching this video, are you a collector of Japanese vinyl or of Japanese SACDs? Do you listen to Japanese musicians? If so, who are your favorites? Have you seen a concert from a band like Deep Purple in Japan? What was that like compared to seeing these bands, in Cincinnati or in Birmingham, England, or in Bern, Germany? What were the differences? Were the audiences more receptive? Were they more respectful? Certainly, the Japanese are very good at documenting bands. Japanese TV has unedited live concerts. And so a lot of the stuff you see on YouTube is, in fact, made in Japan. So I hope you enjoyed that brief excursion to the Pacific Rim, and we will see you again soon. Remember, sharing is caring, so share these videos, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and we will see you next time. Take care.